Welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we explore the world's oldest written story, a tale carved into clay tablets thousands of years before the Bible, where a mighty king and a great flood changed everything we thought we knew about ancient memory. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of the day begin to settle, like sediment drifting slowly to the bottom of a deep and ancient river. You do not need to hold anything tonight. Not the thoughts that crowded your morning, not the tasks that followed you through the afternoon, not the worries that waited patiently at the door of evening. None of that is needed here. Here, there is only stillness. There is only the soft darkness behind your eyelids, and the slow, even rhythm of your own breathing. Breathe in. And breathe out. You are about to travel somewhere very old. Older than the stories you were told as a child. Older than the books that shaped your understanding of the world. Older, perhaps, than anything you have ever heard spoken aloud. We are going to ancient Mesopotamia, to the land between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the first cities rose from the dust of the earth, where the first kings placed crowns upon their heads, and where, for the very first time in human history, someone pressed a reed into wet clay and recorded a story. That story is the one we tell tonight. It is a story about a king who was part god and part man. A story about friendship so deep it rearranged the soul. A story about loss so profound it sent a man to the very edges of the world. And a story about a flood, a great and terrible flood, that washed the earth clean long before any other civilization had yet dreamed of writing such a thing down. Let your body grow heavy now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest open, receiving nothing, releasing everything. The story begins in a city called Uruk, behind walls of burnt brick that gleamed like copper in the ancient sun. Let us begin. In the beginning, there was the city of Uruk. And in that city, there was a wall. Not just any wall, but a wall so magnificent, so vast and enduring, that the ancient scribes who first recorded the Epic of Gilgamesh instructed their readers, even before the story proper had begun, to go and look at it. To walk its foundations. To climb its battlements and gaze out across the world. To examine its brickwork, the perfection of its mortar, the genius of its construction. Go up, the text says, and walk on the walls of Uruk. Inspect the foundation terrace and examine the brickwork. See if it is not made of kiln-fired brick, and if the 7 wise men did not lay its foundations. This wall was not just a wall. It was a statement. It was the declaration of a civilization that had looked upon the chaos of the world and decided to impose order upon it. It was the evidence of human ambition made permanent in clay and fire. And the man who built it, the king who caused it to rise from the flat earth of Mesopotamia, was Gilgamesh. Let us understand who Gilgamesh was, before we speak of what he did. Because the nature of a hero matters enormously in mythology. The nature of a being tells us what kind of story we are entering, and what kind of lessons the story will ask us to carry. Gilgamesh was not entirely human, and he was not entirely divine. The ancient texts tell us that he was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. This is a strange and fascinating proportion. It is not quite the half and half of a simple demigod. It is something more tilted toward the divine, and yet the human third, that remaining fraction of mortality, was the part that would define everything about him. His mother was Ninsun, a goddess of great wisdom, sometimes called the Lady of the Wild Cows. She was beautiful and divine, and she understood things that mortal women could not. His father was Lugalbanda, a king, a mortal king, who had once been deified in the mythology of Sumer, elevated after his death to the status of a god of shepherds and heroes. And yet, despite these lofty origins, despite the divine blood that ran thick through his veins, Gilgamesh was mortal. He would age. He would die. And the story of Gilgamesh is, at its deepest root, the story of a man grappling with that knowledge. But we are not yet at the part of the story where Gilgamesh understands that. At the beginning, Gilgamesh does not think much about mortality. He thinks about power. He thinks about himself. He is the king of Uruk, and Uruk is the greatest city in the world, and the greatest city in the world deserves a king who is the greatest of men. And by most measures, Gilgamesh was exactly that. He was beautiful in the way that gods are beautiful, not merely handsome, but radiant, almost overwhelming to look upon. The texts describe him as surpassing all other kings, as being a man of perfect proportions, 11 cubits tall, an impossible, mythological height that signals something beyond the ordinary. He was strong in a way that made other men feel the smallness of their own bodies. He was swift and brave, and when he walked through the streets of Uruk, people stepped aside not because they feared him but because his presence was simply too large for ordinary space. He had also traveled to the ends of the world, which is a thing we will return to in great detail. He had seen secret things, hidden things, the foundations of the deep. He had brought back knowledge from before the flood, knowledge that had been inscribed on a stone tablet and deposited in the walls of Uruk itself, hidden there like a treasure, waiting to be found. This framing device, this instruction to look at the wall, to find the tablet, is one of the most beautiful things about the epic. It tells us that the story is its own monument. That the words you are hearing are the gift Gilgamesh left behind. Not a living body. Not a dynasty. Not even a throne. A story, pressed into clay, left in the foundations of a wall that was itself built to outlast him. But the Gilgamesh of the beginning, the young Gilgamesh, the king in his glory, does not yet know that words will be his monument. He believes that the monument will be something grander. Something physical. Something that can be seen and touched. And in the meantime, he rules Uruk with a hand that, we must be honest, is not gentle. The opening sections of the epic do not hide this. Gilgamesh, for all his magnificence, is a tyrant. Not a cartoonish villain, the ancient Mesopotamians were not simplistic storytellers, but a man whose immense power has not yet been tempered by wisdom or love or grief. He is king, and he knows it, and the people of Uruk are caught beneath the weight of his knowing. He exhausts the young men of the city with endless labor, building the walls, always building, always demanding more. He claims a right of the first night with brides before their grooms may lie with them. He is restless, energy without outlet, power without purpose. He is, in the language of mythology, a hero in the raw state, magnificent and terrible and not yet finished. The people of Uruk, burdened by their magnificent king, cry out to the gods. This is one of the most human moments in the entire epic. The gods look down at Uruk, and they do not dismiss the prayers of the people. They hear them. They consider them. And then they do something remarkable, they decide to create a counterpart for Gilgamesh. Not to destroy him, not to replace him, but to complete him. To give this half-formed hero the thing he is missing. They decide to give him a friend. This is the wisdom of the ancient gods of Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki, the great ones who sat in council in the heavens. They understood something that we still sometimes struggle to understand, that a person of great power, without a true equal, will always be dangerous. Not because they are evil, but because unchecked greatness has no mirror. It cannot see itself. It cannot be questioned. It cannot be softened. To create the counterpart of Gilgamesh, the gods turned to Aruru, the great mother goddess, the goddess of creation, she who had once formed humanity itself from clay and the blood of a slain god. They called upon her craft, her ancient knowledge of shaping. And Aruru, in answer to the cries of Uruk, in answer to the will of the divine assembly, took clay in her hands. She wet it. She shaped it. She pressed the image of the divine into it, a reflection of Anu, the sky god, the father of gods, and she breathed life into what she had made. She let it fall upon the open steppe. And in that place, in that wilderness far from walls and cities and the smell of burning clay, a being opened its eyes for the very first time. His name was Enkidu. And the world would never be quite the same. Enkidu was everything that Gilgamesh was not, and everything that Gilgamesh needed. Where Gilgamesh was civilization, walls, cities, power, order imposed upon chaos, Enkidu was wildness itself. He was covered in shaggy hair, long and matted, like the fur of an animal. He moved on all fours, or perhaps just at the edges of upright. The texts are beautifully ambiguous, And he grazed on grass with the gazelles and drank at the watering holes with the beasts of the steppe. He knew nothing of cities. He knew nothing of bread or beer, nothing of the clothing that humans wear, nothing of the laws and hierarchies that organize human life. He was, in the most complete sense, a creature of nature, untamed, unhurried, perfectly at home in the wilderness that terrified the people of the cities. He was also, the texts make clear, enormously powerful. As large as Gilgamesh, as beautiful in his wild way, as strong in his arms and legs. He protected the animals of the steppe. When hunters came to set their traps, Enkidu was there, filling in the pits, pulling up the snares, following after the herds like a guardian spirit. The hunters were frightened of him. They had never seen anything like him. Their livelihoods were being destroyed by this being who was neither man nor animal, who came from nowhere and seemed to answer to nothing. One hunter went to his father in distress. The father counseled his son to travel to Uruk, to go to the king, to tell Gilgamesh what was happening on the steppe. And so the hunter went to Uruk. And Gilgamesh listened. And Gilgamesh, who was, after all, two-thirds god, and who had access to a kind of wisdom that sometimes surprised even him, knew what to do. He did not send soldiers. He did not send a hunting party. He sent a woman. Her name was Shamhat. She was a priestess of the great goddess Ishtar, a sacred woman, a woman whose body and presence carried the power of civilization, of human connection, of the knowledge that separates humanity from the beasts. She was what we might call, in the scholarly language, a sacred prostitute, though this phrase carries modern weights that do not belong in the ancient context. She was a servant of the divine feminine. She was a vessel of transformation. Gilgamesh sent her to the watering hole where Enkidu came to drink, and he told the hunter to show her to the wild man, and to let her do the rest. And there, at the edge of the water, beneath a sky that had not yet heard the name of any city, Shamhat unveiled herself before Enkidu. And Enkidu came to her. For 6 days and 7 nights, the texts tell us, they lay together. 6 days and 7 nights, a poetic and mythological number, a span of time that mirrors the creation itself, the ancient week of making. And when it was over, when Enkidu rose and turned back toward the animals he had lived among, something had changed. The gazelles fled from him. The wild creatures scattered. The bond between Enkidu and the natural world, that perfect, wordless communion with the wilderness, had been severed. He could not run as fast as he once had. He could not move as freely. Something had been taken from him. But something had also been given. He sat at Shamhat's feet, and he listened. And she spoke to him of Uruk, of the city, of the great king Gilgamesh, of the noise and light and warmth and community of human civilization. She spoke to him of bread and beer, of feasts and music, of the pleasures and the purposes of life among people. And something in Enkidu heard these words and recognized them as a kind of coming home. He had been made for this moment. He had been shaped from clay precisely to step out of the wilderness and into the human world, to stand before Gilgamesh, to become what Gilgamesh needed. He asked Shamhat to take him to Uruk. And the story truly begins. The journey from the wilderness to the city is one of the most ancient and enduring themes in human storytelling. It is the journey from the natural to the cultivated, from instinct to reflection, from solitude to society. It is, in many ways, the journey of humanity itself, the long, stumbling, magnificent walk from the open steppe to the walled city, from wandering to settlement, from animal to human. Enkidu made that journey with Shamhat at his side. But before they reached Uruk, before the wild man could stand before the walls of the greatest city in the world, the story pauses, as all good stories do, to show us the transformation in detail. Because transformation is never instant. It is never clean. It happens in stages, each one requiring something to be given up, and something new to be received. The first stage was bread. Enkidu had never eaten bread before. His entire existence had been the raw food of the wilderness, grass and leaves and whatever the steppe provided. Bread is one of the definitive products of human civilization. It requires wheat to be grown, harvested, ground into flour. It requires water to be mixed in precise proportion. It requires fire to bake it, and a human hand to shape it. It is, in every way, an act of culture. An act of transformation. The turning of raw nature into something new. When the food of humans was placed before Enkidu, he did not know what to do with it. He sat and stared at it, uncertain, perhaps suspicious. But Shamhat was patient. She showed him how to eat. She showed him how to drink the beer that was also set before him, another product of fermentation, of the careful transformation of grain into something that warms and lightens. He ate 7 loaves of bread. He drank 7 jugs of beer. Again, the number 7. The sacred number, the number of completion in the ancient Near Eastern world. Enkidu's transformation into a human being was completed not in a single dramatic moment but through the slow ritual of eating and drinking, through the most ordinary and most profound of human acts. And when the eating and the drinking was done, his heart grew merry and his face shone, the texts tell us. He washed himself in water. He anointed himself with oil. He was clothed in garments, and he became, in his outward appearance, something that resembled a man, though still magnificent, still larger than ordinary, still carrying the wildness in his eyes and in the power of his hands. Shamhat looked at him in his new garments, and she was glad. Now, before they reached Uruk, something happened on the road that gives us one of the most interesting early windows into the character of Enkidu and the nature of his goodness. They encountered a man who was traveling to a celebration, a wedding feast. And this man, in his excitement and perhaps in his unthinking acceptance of the customs of the time, mentioned the tradition of the king's right, that Gilgamesh would lie with the bride before the groom. He spoke of it as something simply accepted, something built into the order of things. Enkidu's face changed. Something in him, the wild instinct that still lived beneath the new clothing, the deep sense of what was fair and what was not, the uncorrupted moral clarity of the creature who had lived outside human custom, revolted at this. He stood up. He went to Uruk. And he placed himself in the doorway of the wedding house, blocking the passage, refusing to let Gilgamesh exercise this claimed right. What follows is one of the great scenes of ancient literature. Gilgamesh came to the wedding house and found his path blocked by a being he had never seen before, a being as large as himself, as strong, as magnificent, and utterly unintimidated. The two men looked at each other. Perhaps the air between them crackled with recognition, the recognition of a true equal, something that Gilgamesh had never encountered before. And then they fought. The fight between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is described with physical vividness. They grapple like wild bulls. They shake the walls of the wedding house. They shatter the doorposts. The earth shakes beneath their struggle. These are not two ordinary men fighting, they are two forces of the world in collision, two great principles of existence testing themselves against each other. Gilgamesh was the better wrestler. He brought Enkidu to his knee, not by brute force alone, but by skill, by the martial wisdom of a king who had trained his body as he had trained his mind. The fight concluded with Gilgamesh on top, but the victory was not quite what it appeared to be. Because in the moment of his victory, Gilgamesh was also changed. He had never faced anyone who could match him so closely. He had never had to struggle like that, never had to reach to the very depths of himself to win. And in reaching those depths, he had discovered something, a kind of respect, a kind of wonder, a kind of recognition that he had not known he was missing. The two men looked at each other after the fight, breathing hard, both of them altered. And then they embraced. This embrace, this transformation of combat into friendship, is one of the most moving moments in the entire epic, and it echoes forward through thousands of years of literature and mythology. It is the moment when two great but incomplete beings recognize in each other the missing half of themselves. It is the moment when rivalry becomes love. Not romantic love, in the way we might use that word today, though the epic is not shy about the depth and physical tenderness of their bond, and scholars have long debated what we might call the nature of it. But love in the truest and deepest sense, the complete commitment to another person's well-being, the willingness to be altered by knowing them, the grief that comes when they are lost. This friendship, this love, is the emotional center of the entire Epic of Gilgamesh. Everything that comes before it is prologue. Everything that comes after it is consequence. Ninsun, the goddess mother of Gilgamesh, received Enkidu as if he were her own son. She placed a pendant around his neck and spoke words of blessing. She adopted him into the household of the king, into the divine family that was also, now, the human family of Gilgamesh. And Enkidu wept. The wild man who had lived on the steppe without tears, without the particular human vulnerability that is weeping, he wept. Because he had been given something he had not known he was missing. He had been given a home. He had been given belonging. In the streets of Uruk, the people watched as their king walked with this strange and magnificent creature, this Enkidu, and they marveled. They saw that something had shifted in Gilgamesh, a softening, a deepening. He was still their king, still powerful beyond ordinary measure. But there was something in his face now that had not been there before. Something that might have been called happiness. But happiness, in mythology, is never a destination. It is always a crossroads. And from this crossroads, the two friends would soon set out on a journey that would change them both forever. Even the most settled and contented soul grows restless. And the soul of Gilgamesh, for all the joy of his new friendship, was not built for stillness. The texts describe him lying in his bed, unable to sleep, filled with a nameless dissatisfaction. He was king of the greatest city in the world. He had Enkidu at his side. He had the love of his mother the goddess, the devotion of his people, the walls of Uruk rising magnificent around him. But it was not enough. Because Gilgamesh was 2/3 god, and gods do not die. And yet his 1/3 mortality lay there in the dark of his sleeping chamber, whispering to him. Reminding him. Telling him what he did not want to know. He said to Enkidu, I want to go to the cedar forest. I want to slay the great monster Humbaba who lives there. I want to do something that will leave my name upon the world after I am gone. This is the first articulation of what will become the driving obsession of the entire epic. Gilgamesh wants to earn eternal fame because he cannot have eternal life. He wants to make a name that will persist in the mouths of men long after his mortal third has crumbled to dust. He wants the immortality of story, of monument, of legendary deeds. He is, in this, deeply and recognizably human. But Gilgamesh would not be dissuaded. There is a tender and somewhat heartbreaking quality to this exchange. Enkidu is afraid, and he does not hide it. He has no shame about his fear, he is still, in some ways, the wild creature who operated on instinct, who understood danger without the overlay of pride that makes civilized men pretend not to be frightened. And Gilgamesh, hearing his friend's fear, is moved. But he is also driven. And the drive is stronger than the tenderness. He goes to the elders of Uruk. He tells them of his plan. The elders, like wise men throughout human history, counsel caution. They tell him that Humbaba is not to be underestimated. They remind him that the cedar forest is the dwelling place of a being ordained by the gods themselves to guard a sacred space. They ask him not to rely on his own strength alone, to remember that even the greatest warrior can be caught off guard, can find the unexpected waiting for him. But they also, in the way of elders throughout human history, ultimately concede to the king's will. They give him their blessing, even as they worry. And then they say something beautiful and poignant, let Enkidu walk before you. He knows the roads, he knows the way of the forest. May he protect you. This is the role of friendship made explicit. Gilgamesh is the king, the god descended, the magnificent. But it is Enkidu, the wild man, the recently civilized, the one still carrying the steppe in his lungs, who is asked to be the protector, the one who walks first into the unknown. Because wisdom sometimes lives in exactly the places power does not think to look. Gilgamesh went to his mother, to Ninsun the goddess, to receive her blessing. And here we have one of the most moving sequences in the epic, the mother's prayer. Ninsun washed herself, she dressed in her finest raiments, she placed her crown upon her head, and she climbed to the roof of the great palace. She burned incense. And then she prayed to Shamash, the sun god, the great god of justice and light, on behalf of her son. She asked why Shamash had given her son so restless a heart. She asked why he had placed in Gilgamesh a yearning that could not be satisfied by anything the world ordinarily offers. She asked Shamash to protect Gilgamesh on the road, to send the great winds to help him in his battle, to bring him home safely. And then she did something unexpected. She adopted Enkidu as her own son. She placed around his neck the sacred pendant of adoption and spoke words that bound Enkidu to her household, to her protection, to the family of Gilgamesh. So the two men who were going to walk into the dark together were now brothers. Not by blood, but by love and divine ceremony. They set out. The journey to the cedar forest was long. The ancient texts give us distance in terms of days' journeys, and the numbers are again mythological. They travel in 3 days what would take ordinary men a month and a half. Their legs are tireless. Their pace is supernatural. They are propelled not just by physical strength but by the narrative energy of the epic itself, by the sense that the story is moving towards something important. Along the way, Gilgamesh had dreams. And dreams, in the ancient Mesopotamian world, were not random. They were messages. They were windows opened between the mortal world and the divine. They were the gods whispering, or warning, or preparing the dreamer for what was to come. He dreamed 3 dreams before they reached the cedar forest. Each one was terrifying, mountains collapsing, sky going dark, terrible presences looming over him. Each time, he woke frightened and woke Enkidu and told him what he had seen. And each time, Enkidu interpreted the dream for him. And each interpretation, while acknowledging the fear within the dream, turned the terrible imagery toward hope. The fallen mountain is Humbaba, and we will overcome him. The darkened sky is the storm before victory. The terrible presence is what we will defeat together. This is friendship as anchor. This is the other person holding the lantern when your own has gone out. Enkidu, who feared this journey more deeply than Gilgamesh did, nonetheless became the one who kept Gilgamesh's courage burning. This is one of the paradoxes that makes the friendship between them so profound. The one who was most afraid was the one who gave most comfort. When they arrived at the cedar forest, they stopped. The cedar forest of Mesopotamian mythology is not merely a forest. It is a place of divine significance, a threshold between the human world and the sacred world, a space that the gods themselves have designated as protected, as other. The trees that grow there are of surpassing height and beauty. The cedars of Lebanon and the ancient cedar forests of what is now Iran and Turkey were among the most valuable resources in the ancient world, prized for the quality of their wood, the rarity of their resinous fragrance, the sheer majesty of their form. Humbaba is the guardian of this place. He was appointed by Enlil, the god of wind and storm and earth, to ensure that no human being could enter and take what grew there without divine permission. He is a monster in the ancient sense, not necessarily evil, but monstrous. Larger than human. Appointed to a purpose. Operating according to the will of a god. His face, the texts tell us, is like a tangle of intestines, not a pretty image, not a Hollywood monster, but something viscerally wrong, something that sits at the intersection of the digestive and the fearsome in a way that seems to have been designed to provoke deep, instinctive revulsion. He has 7 auras, radiances of divine protection, that emanate from him and which make him nearly impossible to approach. And yet Gilgamesh and Enkidu entered the forest. Shamash, the sun god, heard Ninsin's prayer. He sent the great winds, 13 of them, the texts say, 13 winds blowing from every direction, to confound and disorient Humbaba, to strip away his auras one by one, to leave him exposed and vulnerable in a way that the great guardian had perhaps never been before. And this is where the epic does something unexpected and deeply interesting. When Humbaba was caught and held at Gilgamesh's mercy, he spoke. He addressed Gilgamesh and Enkidu by name. He said, "Let me go. Spare my life. I will cut down as many trees as you need. I will be your servant." He begged. The monster begged. And Enkidu, the wild man, the creature of nature who had lived among animals and understood the world of the steppe, was moved. Or was he? The texts at this point are slightly ambiguous, and different translations have different readings. In some, it is Enkidu who urges Gilgamesh to kill Humbaba quickly, before the pleas can weaken Gilgamesh's resolve. In others, it is Gilgamesh who wavers and Enkidu who steadies him. But either way, Humbaba dies. Gilgamesh strikes the blow. Humbaba falls. The guardian of the cedar forest is dead. And the great trees are cut down. There is a shadow over this victory that the ancient storytellers did not hide. Humbaba, in his dying words, curses Enkidu. He says, in some versions, that Enkidu will not live to old age. That the gods will not forget what has been done here. That the one who urged the killing will bear the consequence. The curse lands in the narrative like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward slowly, and we will not feel their full force for several sections yet. But they are there, moving beneath the surface of the story, working their way toward the center. The two friends, victorious, cut down the great cedars. They fashion a raft from the tallest of the trees, a cedar so large that its door could serve as the gate of a city, and they float down the river, back toward Uruk, carrying their triumph. They are returning as heroes. They do not yet know the price that has been set. There is something about a hero at the peak of his power that draws the attention of the divine. Gilgamesh, returning to Uruk after the defeat of Humbaba, after the cutting of the great cedars, was at the very height of his magnificence. He had done what no king before him had done. He had walked into the sacred forest and faced the appointed guardian of the gods and prevailed. He had proven his strength to the world, to the gods, and perhaps most importantly, to himself. He washed the dust of the road from his body. He dressed himself in clean robes, the finest garments of the king. He placed his crown upon his head. He shook the battle from his hair and let it fall clean around his shoulders. And the goddess Ishtar saw him. Ishtar, called Inanna in the older Sumerian tradition, is one of the most complex and powerful figures in all of Mesopotamian mythology. She is the goddess of love and war, of fertility and destruction, of the morning star and the evening star. She is Venus in the sky, brilliant and inescapable. She is the force that brings living things together in desire, and the force that rips them apart in conflict. She is also, in the ancient texts, a goddess who loves and loses her loves repeatedly, who is known for the intensity of her desire and the catastrophic consequences that sometimes follow when that desire goes wrong. She looked at Gilgamesh in his beauty and his triumph, and she wanted him. She offered herself to him. She said, "Come to me, Gilgamesh, and be my bridegroom. Give me the gift of your fruit. You shall be my husband and I shall be your wife." She promised him things that would make any king's heart race, a chariot of gold and lapis lazuli, a house of cedar, kings and princes bowing at his feet, his goats bearing triplets, his donkeys outrunning mules, his chariot horses known across the world for their speed and beauty. It was, in every way, a magnificent offer. And Gilgamesh refused it. What follows is one of the most remarkable speeches in ancient literature, remarkable for its boldness, its intelligence, its cruelty, and its accuracy. Gilgamesh's refusal of Ishtar is not a polite decline. It is a detailed, methodical, almost prosecutorial accounting of Ishtar's history with her lovers. He reminded her of Tammuz, the young shepherd god who became her love and who she sent to the underworld, where he remains still, weeping, while the world above mourns his absence every year. He reminded her of the lion she had trapped and the bird she had trapped and the shepherd she had turned into a wolf and the gardener Ishalanu who had brought her gifts of food and whom she had crushed when he rejected her advances. "Which of your husbands did you love forever?" he asked. "Which of your shepherds pleased you for all time? Come, and I will tell you the tale of your lovers. It is extraordinary. It is brave to the point of recklessness. It is, in some ways, the act of a man who has just defeated a monster and perhaps feels briefly invincible in a way that men who have nearly died often feel. And it is, also, correct. Everything he said about Ishtar's loves was true. But truth offered in this way, without mercy, without the softening of diplomacy, without any acknowledgement of the goddess's power even in the act of cataloguing her history, is a weapon. And Gilgamesh, in his magnificent pride, had just turned that weapon on a goddess. Ishtar went to the heavens in tears. But not in grief, in fury. She went to Anu, the Sky Father, the king of the gods. She said, "My father, Gilgamesh has shamed me. He has spoken of my dishonors. He has refused me. Give me the bowl of heaven, that I may punish him. If you do not give it to me, I will break down the gates of the underworld and bring up the dead to eat the living." This is Ishtar at her most terrifying. The threat to release the dead is not empty. She is the goddess with the power to descend to the underworld, to negotiate with Ereshkigal its queen, to move between the worlds of the living and the dead. Her threat carries weight. And Anu was cautious. He pointed out to her that Gilgamesh's words had been true, that she had in fact treated her lovers badly. He noted the practical difficulties. But Ishtar was insistent, and the gods know better than to deny Ishtar twice. He gave her the bowl of heaven. The bowl of heaven, the great divine animal that corresponds to the constellation of Taurus, descended upon Uruk in a cloud of terrible power. When it snorted, the earth opened. When it stamped the ground, pits appeared into which men fell by the dozens. The first snort of the bull opened a pit and 300 warriors of Uruk fell into it. The second snort opened another pit, and 300 more were lost. The city was in chaos. The beast was unstoppable. But Enkidu and Gilgamesh were there. Enkidu seized the bowl of heaven by its horns. The bull thrashed and foamed and drove its body against him with divine force. Enkidu held on. He kept the bull from killing any more of the people of Uruk. And he called to Gilgamesh, "Come, brother. Strike. Strike between the nape and the horns." Gilgamesh drew his sword. He struck. The bowl of heaven died. Ishtar came to the walls of Uruk. She wailed. She screamed her grief and her fury down at the two heroes who had killed her divine gift, her weapon of revenge. She tore her robes. She was devastated. And Enkidu, the wild man, the one who had lived with animals and felt the pull of the natural world so deeply, did something that sealed his fate. He cut a piece of the bull's thigh and threw it at Ishtar's feet. "If only I could reach you," he shouted at her, "this is what I would do to you." The people of Uruk cheered. The victory was celebrated. The two friends gloried in what they had done. Gilgamesh sang songs to the women of the palace. The two heroes sat down to a feast. But in the heavens above, the gods were in council. And the council was not debating whether to celebrate with the heroes of Uruk. They were debating who must die. The gods held their assembly in the heavens. Anu spoke. Enlil spoke. Ea spoke. The divine council of the ancient world gathered in the space between the stars and looked down at what had happened. Humbaba, the guardian of the sacred cedar forest, was dead. The bowl of heaven, the instrument of divine retribution sent at Ishtar's request, was also dead. Two sacred things had been destroyed by two mortal men, or rather, by one man and one man-creature, though the distinction mattered less now than the consequence. Someone had to pay. Enlil, the god of wind and storm, the god who had appointed Humbaba to his post in the first place, was clear. The price for the death of the guardian and the slaying of the bowl of heaven was a life. And since Gilgamesh was protected by his mother the goddess, by the prayers of Ninsun, by the attention of Shamash, since Gilgamesh was two-thirds divine and the city of Uruk needed its king, the life to be taken was Enkidu's. Enkidu must die. Shamash protested. He spoke on behalf of Enkidu, pointing out that the wild man had been created by the gods themselves, that he had been sent to the city to complement the king, that he had done what he was made to do. The protest was heard. And then set aside. The decree stood. Enkidu fell sick. The illness came upon him not as the sudden violence of a battle wound but as the slow, creeping deterioration of a body slowly being withdrawn from the world. He lay in his bed in the palace of Uruk, in the soft and decorated rooms of civilization that he had entered so recently, and he felt the life going out of him by degrees. He was angry. He was frightened. He was devastated. He cursed the gate of cedar through which he had passed when entering the cedar forest, saying that if he had known what it would cost him he would have shattered it with an axe. He cursed the hunter who had brought Shamhat to the watering hole, the man who had first set in motion the chain of events that took him from the wilderness. And then he cursed Shamhat herself. This is one of the most complex and human moments in the entire epic. In his fear and his pain and his desperate anger at what was being taken from him, Enkidu turned on the woman who had transformed him, who had opened the door of civilization to him, who had brought him to the city and to Gilgamesh. He spoke terrible words against her. He blamed her for his death, because without her transformation of him, without his entry into the human world, he would not have been caught in the web of consequences that was now killing him. He was wrong, of course. He was dying the way people who are dying sometimes handle the enormity of it, by looking for a cause, for an origin, for someone to receive the grief as blame. But then Shamash spoke to him from the heavens. And the sun god reminded Enkidu of everything that his life had given him. The bread and the beer. The clothing. The friendship of a king. The love of Ninsun, goddess mother, who had adopted him as her son. The glory of the battles they had fought together. The songs that were sung about him in the streets of Uruk. And Enkidu was silent for a moment. And then he blessed Shamhat. He took back the curse and replaced it with blessing. May she be loved, may she be adorned, may merchants and kings bring her gifts, may her threshold be a place of honor. This reversal, this movement from curse to blessing, from blame to gratitude, is one of the great moral moments of the epic. It is the recognition that the life we are given, however painful its ending, was worth living. It is the choice to love even in grief. Then Enkidu dreamed. He dreamed of the underworld, the house of darkness, the place that the ancient Mesopotamians called the realm of Ereshkigal, the great queen below. He dreamed of a being with a dark face and the talons of an eagle, who seized him and carried him downward into a place of dust and shadow. The description of the underworld in the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest recorded accounts of what ancient people believed happened after death, and it is not a comforting one. There is no paradise there, no reward, no gardens of the blessed. There is only the house of dust, where the dead sit in darkness, dressed in feathers like birds, eating clay and dust for food. The kings of the earth are there, stripped of their crowns. The priests are there, stripped of their offices. The great and the small sit together in the same gray shadow. He grew weaker. Day by day, the illness consumed him. 12 days the texts say, 12 days of dying, of the long, slow, unbearable process of leaving the world. And Gilgamesh sat beside him. This is one of the most tender and devastating portrayals of grief in all of ancient literature. Gilgamesh, the magnificent, the king, the two-thirds divine, sat beside his dying friend and could do nothing. All his power, all his divine blood, all the might that had defeated Humbaba and the bowl of heaven, none of it could hold Enkidu in the world. Enkidu looked at Gilgamesh and said, "My friend, why do you weep? You will not go before me. But you will be left after I am gone." These words are very old. They were pressed into clay approximately 4,000 years ago, and they still carry their full weight. Because they are true. And they are the truth that every living person who has ever loved someone will eventually know. One of you will be left after the other is gone. Enkidu died on the 12th day. Gilgamesh stood over the body of his friend and would not believe it at first. He touched Enkidu's face. He spoke to him. He covered him with a cloth as if he were simply sleeping. He sat with him through the night, the way that ancient traditions required the living to sit with the dead, as if the presence of love could hold the soul from departing too quickly. He wept. The great king of Uruk sat on the floor beside his dead friend and wept. And then, when the first light of morning came, he rose. He gave Enkidu a funeral of surpassing magnificence, the most elaborate and detailed funeral described in the ancient Mesopotamian texts. He sent throughout the land for craftsmen and artisans. He commissioned statues of gold and lapis lazuli and carnelian in Enkidu's image. He dedicated weapons and tools to his friend. He brought offerings to the gods of the underworld, to Ereshkigal, to the gatekeepers, to all the divine presences who would now be keeping Enkidu in their realm. He wanted to be sure that Enkidu would be treated with honor in the house of dust. He wanted to be sure that even in death, the wild man who had become his brother would not be forgotten. And then Gilgamesh left Uruk. He left his throne, his city, his walls, his people. He wandered out into the wilderness wearing the skins of animals, perhaps unconsciously echoing the wildness of Enkidu, perhaps trying to find his friend in the places where Enkidu had first lived. He was overwhelmed by grief, and beneath the grief was something else, something that had been quietly growing since the moment of Enkidu's dying. Fear. Because Gilgamesh had watched death up close now. He had seen it take the strongest, most alive person he had ever known. And the thought that followed, the thought he could not stop, one day, it would come for him. The question that now drove Gilgamesh across the world was not the same question that had driven him to the cedar forest. He was no longer looking for glory. He was no longer looking to leave his name carved into the world. He was looking for a way to never die. Grief changes the direction of a life. Not always immediately. Not always cleanly. But eventually, if the grief is deep enough, it redirects everything. The person you were before the loss is not quite the person who continues after. The goals, the certainties, the understanding of what matters, all of these shift. And what emerges from the other side is a new kind of person, shaped by the contours of what has been lost. Gilgamesh emerged from the depths of his mourning with one purpose, and one purpose only. He was going to find Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim, the name means something like he who found life, or he who saw life. He was, according to the tradition of the ancient Mesopotamian world, the only mortal human being who had ever been granted immortality by the gods. He lived at the source of the rivers, at the place where the waters of life rose up from the deep. He lived beyond the mountains, beyond the waters, beyond the edges of the known world. He was, in short, at the end of everything. And Gilgamesh was going to walk there. This quest, this journey to the end of the world, is the great second movement of the epic, and it is one of the most ancient hero's journey narratives we have. Gilgamesh is going to travel through impossible places, face impossible guardians, cross impossible waters, to stand before the one being who might have an answer to the question that was destroying him. The question, is there any way to live forever? Is there any way to not die? His road took him to the mountain of Mashu, the great twin-peaked mountain at the edge of the world, the mountain through which the sun passed each night on its journey from west to east, moving through the underworld tunnels of darkness to emerge again in the morning. This mountain was the boundary between the human world and what lay beyond. It was guarded by beings unlike anything in the city of Uruk. The guardians of Mashu were the scorpion people. They are among the most striking and visually compelling creatures in the entire mythology of Mesopotamia. Their upper bodies were human, they had arms and faces, they could speak and think and reason. But from the waist down, they were scorpions, and their radiance, the terrible divine light that emanated from their forms, was so powerful that it could kill a mortal who looked at them too directly. When the scorpion man saw Gilgamesh approaching, he said to his wife, "He who comes to us, his body is the flesh of gods." The divine blood in Gilgamesh was evident even to the guardians of the impossible mountain. They could see him for what he was. And yet they were not unkind to him. The scorpion man asked Gilgamesh what he was doing at the edge of the world. And Gilgamesh told him, with the directness of a man who has given up on pretense, he was looking for Utnapishtim. He wanted to ask him about death and life. He wanted to find the secret of eternal life. There is something unbearably vulnerable about this moment. Gilgamesh, the king who had refused the goddess of love with devastating eloquence, who had killed the guardian of the sacred forest and the bowl of heaven, was standing at the gate of the mountains and saying, essentially, I am terrified of dying. I watched my best friend die and I cannot bear the thought that I will die too. Help me. Tell me where to go. The scorpion man was moved by this. He acknowledged the truth of Gilgamesh's grief. He also told him something sobering: no mortal had ever walked through the tunnel of Mashu, the 12-league path through the mountains where the sun traveled at night. It was total darkness. It was a journey that would require Gilgamesh to walk for 12 leagues without light, 12 leagues being the distance that the sun covered in its nighttime passage through the earth. He told Gilgamesh that the tunnel would be open to him. He let the king pass. And Gilgamesh entered the darkness. The tunnel of Mashu is one of the most powerful images in the entire epic, the hero walking in absolute darkness, in a passage that is not meant for mortal creatures, where there is no light at all for the first 8 leagues, and only the faintest hint of a breeze beginning at the 9th, and the first touch of light at the 11th, and finally the full light of the east emerging at the 12th. He ran. He ran through the darkness, through the mountain's interior, through the passage that the sun used and that no living human was supposed to walk. He ran, perhaps, because standing still in that darkness, with nothing to see and nothing to hear but the sound of his own breathing and his own heartbeat, would have been intolerable. And he emerged. He emerged into a garden. The garden at the other end of the mountain passage is one of the most beautiful images in ancient literature, a garden where the trees bore precious stones as their fruit. Carnelian hung from the branches like ripe fruit. Lapis lazuli grew on the vines. The foliage gleamed like crystal. The light there was the light of the setting sun, or the rising sun, or perhaps both, the liminal, glowing, impossible light of a place that was not quite part of the ordinary world. This is the Garden of the Sun, the place where Shamash himself emerges each morning. And it was there that Gilgamesh found the first person willing to speak to him about his quest in the deep way he needed. Siduri. Siduri was the divine tavern keeper, a woman who lived at the edge of the sea, by the waters that separated the mortal world from the place where Utnapishtim dwelled. She made beer. She made wine. She was a figure of warm, earthly pleasure, of rest and sustenance and the small joys of living, in a landscape of impossible grandeur. When Gilgamesh first approached her, she barred her door. He looked terrible, he was dressed in animal skins, he was wild with grief, he was gaunt from traveling, his face did not look like the face of a happy man. She thought he might be a murderer or a madman. But Gilgamesh spoke to her from behind the door. He told her who he was. He told her about Enkidu. He told her about the grief that had driven him here. And she opened the door. What follows is one of the most frequently cited passages in the entire epic, and one of the most debated. Siduri offered Gilgamesh counsel that sounds, depending on how you read it, either like wisdom or like an invitation to give up. She said, when the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, make merry each day and night. Of each day, make a feast of rejoicing. Day and night, dance and play. Let your garments be sparkling fresh, your head be washed, bathe yourself in water. Cherish the little child who holds your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. These things alone are the concern of mankind. This speech has been called, by many scholars, the oldest recorded philosophy of human happiness, an ancient carpe diem, a Mesopotamian hedonism, a 4,000-year-old instruction to live fully in the present rather than chasing the impossible. But Gilgamesh would not be diverted. He heard the wisdom in her words, he could not have failed to hear it, and he set it aside. Because the loss of Enkidu was too recent, too absolute. He was not ready for philosophy. He was still in the raw center of grief. He still needed to know. He asked her how to reach Utnapishtim. She told him that the way was dangerous, the waters of death lay between here and there, waters that would kill any mortal who touched them. But she told him that a boatman named Urshanabi was there, and that if anyone could take him across, it was Urshanabi. Gilgamesh found Urshanabi. The meeting did not begin smoothly. In his grief-driven wildness, Gilgamesh had already destroyed something important in Urshanabi's boat, the stone punting poles, or in some translations the stone beings that helped propel the craft through the waters of death. This was, to put it mildly, a problem, since crossing the waters of death required something to push with, and if the waters killed on contact, using ordinary wooden poles would mean Gilgamesh's hands touching the water. But Urshanabi was resourceful, and Gilgamesh was willing to do whatever was needed. They cut 300 punting poles from the trees of the shore. And with these poles, each to be used once and then discarded so that no part of the pole or the hands holding it touched the fatal water more than once, they crossed the waters of death. On the other side was a shore. On that shore was a man. And the man, sitting at the edge of the water, watching the approaching boat with the calm, untroubled expression of someone who has seen everything and been surprised by nothing for a very long time, was Utnapishtim. There is a particular quality to the presence of someone who has outlived everything ordinary. Not the presence of someone who is merely very old, though Utnapishtim was certainly that, in ways that went beyond any ordinary calculation of years. But the presence of someone who has been given what every human being has ever wanted and found that it is both everything they imagined and nothing like what they expected. Utnapishtim sat at the edge of the water between the worlds and looked at Gilgamesh coming toward him across the waters of death. He looked at the face of the king of Uruk, the exhausted, grief-ravaged, travel-worn face of a man who had walked from the known world to the edge of everything, and he said something that might have been unexpected. He said, essentially, "You look terrible. You look like a man who has been wandering in the wilderness and sleeping under the open sky. You look like grief and desperation and too many miles without rest. Why have you come here?" And Gilgamesh told him. Again. The story of his life, of Enkidu, of the friendship and the battles and the death of his friend. The story of his fear and his refusal to accept that he would die the same way. The declaration that he had walked to the end of the world to find the one being who might have an answer. Utnapishtim listened. And then he said something that echoed what Siduri had said at the edge of the sea. He spoke of the permanence of death. He spoke of how the dead do not return to the river of life. He spoke of how even great men, even kings, are listed in the house of dust with the servants and the craftsmen and the ordinary people, how the great leveler that is death does not respect the throne. He asked Gilgamesh, when the gods make a decree, why do you argue with it? Will you live forever? It is possible to hear frustration in these words, the frustration of someone who has spent an extraordinarily long time watching mortal humans chase the thing that they cannot have. But there is also something else, a kind of gentleness, perhaps, the gentleness of someone who knows the answer and knows that the answer will not be welcomed. And then Gilgamesh asked the direct question. Tell me, Utnapishtim, how did you find eternal life? How did you come to stand in the assembly of the gods? Utnapishtim looked at him for a long moment. And then he began to tell his story. The story of Utnapishtim, the story of the flood, is one of the oldest narratives in human civilization, and it predates the biblical account in Genesis by at minimum 1,000 years, possibly by more. The tablets on which it is written are among the oldest coherent narrative texts ever discovered. When a young Assyriologist named George Smith, working in the British Museum in 1872, first deciphered the tablet containing the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he was so overcome that he began to remove his clothing in excitement. The world had just learned that the story of Noah's Ark was not the first telling of this story. But we are inside the story now, not in the museum of 1872. We are sitting at the edge of the waters beyond the world, listening with Gilgamesh as Utnapishtim draws back the veil on what happened long, long ago, in the time before the great flood changed the face of the earth. Utnapishtim said, I will reveal to you, Gilgamesh, a hidden matter and a secret of the gods. And in those words, in the framing of the tale as a secret, as a thing hidden by the divine, the most ancient flood narrative begins. There was a city called Shuruppak. Shuruppak was real. It stood on the banks of the Euphrates River in what is now southern Iraq, and archaeologists have found its ruins, and in those ruins they have found evidence of a catastrophic flood, a thick layer of river sediment, a stratum of clay and silt deposited by water that must have risen to a height almost beyond imagining, obliterating everything that came before it and forcing humanity to begin again on the other side. But in the mythological telling, Shuruppak was the city where Utnapishtim lived, in the time when the gods of the world were young enough to grow weary of their creations, and when the gods were still in the habit of meeting in assembly to make decisions that would shake the earth. And in the time of Utnapishtim's story, the great gods, Anu the father, Enlil the counselor of the gods, Ninurta the mighty, Inuji the canal inspector, had gathered together and made a terrible decision. They would send a flood. The reasons given vary slightly across different versions and different tablets of the epic. In some, it is noise, the noise of humanity, the sheer constant clamor of millions of people living and building and worshipping and arguing, had become so overwhelming that Enlil could not sleep. In others, it is overpopulation. In still others, it is a more general divine dissatisfaction, a sense that the human experiment had gone wrong in ways that could only be corrected by starting over. The flood was decided upon. The gods swore an oath of secrecy. They would not tell the humans what was coming. They would allow the flood to come as a surprise, to come upon the cities and the fields and the livestock and the people without warning. But one god could not hold his oath. Ea, the great god of wisdom and fresh water, the craftsman among the gods, the one who had participated in the creation of humanity and who understood mortal beings with a depth that the other gods sometimes lacked, could not let the flood come without at least a gesture toward mercy. He could not speak directly to Utnapishtim, the oath prevented that. He could not say, "There is going to be a flood. Build a boat." The words of the oath bound him. But he could speak to the wall. This is one of the most clever and delightful moments in the entire ancient Near Eastern literary tradition. Ea went to the reed hut where Utnapishtim lived and addressed the wall of the house. He said, "Wall, listen to me. Reed hut, pay attention. Man of Shuruppak, son of Ubartutu, tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon possessions, save life. Spurn property and keep the soul alive. Aboard the boat bring the seed of all living creatures." Utnapishtim, listening from inside his house, heard every word. And he was, to say the least, greatly moved. He asked Ea, still speaking to the wall, still maintaining the fiction, what he should tell the people of the city when they saw him tearing down his house and building a boat on the banks of the river. What explanation could he give? Ea told him, still speaking to the wall, what to say. Tell the people that Enlil has turned against you. Tell them you can no longer live in his city. Tell them you are going to the deep, to the house of Ea. And while you are saying these things, the rain will fall upon them in abundance and the harvest will be rich. This is a remarkable piece of divine misdirection. Ea gave Utnapishtim a cover story that was simultaneously true in its emotional dimension. Enlil was indeed angry, and misleading enough to prevent panic in the city while the boat was being built. The construction of the boat is described in extraordinary detail in the ancient tablets, the kind of detail that makes scholars believe the description was based on real boat-building traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, real knowledge of how a large vessel was constructed in a world of rivers and marshes and seasonal flooding. The boat that Utnapishtim built was not the graceful wooden ark of the Sunday school illustrations. It was something closer to a great square barge, a floating cube. Some scholars have calculated its dimensions based on the ancient Mesopotamian units of measurement given in the text, and arrived at a structure of approximately 60 meters on each side, with 6 decks and 7 compartments on each deck. It was sealed with bitumen, the natural tar that seeped from the ground in ancient Mesopotamia, used to waterproof boats and baskets and walls. It was caulked inside and out. The people of Shuruppak who came to help him build it were given wine to drink. Wine flowed like river water. Oil flowed like water. Feasts were held. There was music and celebration at the edge of the construction site, even as the structure rising from the mud of the riverbank was the largest thing anyone had ever seen anyone build. And all the while Utnapishtim knew what was coming. He loaded the boat with everything he had. Gold and silver. All his family and his relatives. The craftsmen of the city. The animals of the field and the wild creatures, everything, all the seeds of life, all the varieties of being that he could gather and bring aboard. He brought provisions for the journey, food, water, stores of grain. And then the god Shamash, the sun god, the god of justice, spoke and said, "The time I have set is at hand. At the break of dawn, rain will pour down in abundance. Enter the boat and shut the door." Utnapishtim entered the boat. He passed the steering oar to Pusur Muri, the boatman. He sealed the door with bitumen. And at dawn, a black cloud rose on the horizon. What follows in the text is some of the most vivid and terrifying weather description in all of ancient literature. The storm god Adad thundered within the cloud. Shulit and Hanish, the divine heralds of the storm, went before him over the mountains and the plains. Irakel tore out the mooring posts. Ninurta made the dikes overflow. The Anunnaki lifted their torches and set the land ablaze with light. The rain came. It did not come as ordinary rain. It came with a ferocity that the text struggled to describe, a roar like a battle, a darkness like the underworld, a violence that made it impossible to see one person from another, impossible to see the mountains or the sky. The flood rose. The waters overwhelmed the land. Even the gods were afraid. This is crucial and beautiful. Even the gods who had decreed the flood were terrified by what they had unleashed. They fled to the highest heaven, the heaven of Anu, and crouched there at the walls of heaven like dogs, like frightened animals. They watched the waters rise below them and they were afraid. And Ishtar, the great goddess of love and war, who had been the indirect cause of so much of the conflict in Gilgamesh's story, cried out in grief. She wailed. She screamed. She said, "In the olden days when I spoke up in the assembly of the gods, advocating evil to destroy my people, I myself gave birth to my people, and now they fill the sea like fish." Even Ishtar, even the goddess of destruction in her war aspect, was devastated by what she saw. The gods had wanted to control humanity, to quiet it, to punish it. They had not fully reckoned with the love they carried for the things they had made. The other gods wept with Ishtar. The divine council sat in weeping, their lips pressed together, crouching in the highest heaven above the rising waters. For 6 days and 7 nights, the flood and storm continued. 6 days and 7 nights, again that sacred number, the number of creation and completion. What had been created in 7 days, the ordered world of cities and fields and human life, was being unmade in 7 days. The parallel is not accidental. And on the 7th day, the storm subsided. The sea grew calm. The wind dropped. The flood withdrew. Utnapishtim opened a window in the boat, and the light fell on his face. He looked out across the water. Everything was flat. The world was entirely water. The land had drowned. The cities were gone. The fields were gone. The animals and the people were gone. There was only water, stretching to every horizon, and somewhere far away, a solitary peak, the mountain called Nimish, in some translations Nazur, jutting above the surface of the flood. The boat ran aground on the side of Mount Nimish. Utnapishtim waited. He waited 7 days, another 7, on the side of the mountain, the water very slowly receding, the drowned world very slowly reappearing. On the 7th day, he sent out a dove. The dove flew out and returned, because it could find no perching place. The world was still too wet, too bare, too waterlogged. He sent out a swallow. The swallow flew and returned. He sent out a raven. The raven flew out, and did not return. The raven found the receding waters and found the newly exposed land and found food there, the detritus of the flood, the things that float to the surface when disaster passes. The raven did not come back, because there was somewhere to go. And Utnapishtim knew. He opened the vessel. He let everything out, the animals, his family, the craftsmen, the living things he had carried through the flood. They streamed out onto the side of the mountain and into the receding world. Utnapishtim built an altar on the mountain top. He took offerings, a sheep, a goat, a cedar log, and he burned them. He poured out libations. The gods smelled the fragrance of the offering rising from the mountaintop, and they gathered around it like flies. This is the image the text uses, and it is deliberately undignified, deliberately humanizing of the divine. They had been afraid and then they had wept and now they were hungry, because the humans who had fed them with sacrifice and offering were all dead, and the one boat that had survived was sending up the fragrance of an offering for the first time in the long days of the flood, and the gods crowded around the smell of it. But Enlil was not there. Enlil, who had decreed the flood, who had wanted the silence that the death of humanity would bring, Enlil had not come to the offering. And when he arrived and saw the boat on the mountainside, when he saw that there were survivors, he was furious. He demanded to know which god had let this happen. The oath had been sworn. No mortal was supposed to survive. And Ea, the god who had spoken to the wall of the reed hut, who had given Utnapishtim the dream and the warning, spoke up. He did not confess what he had done, exactly. He argued instead with the logic of proportion. He said, "Was it necessary to send the flood for a sin? Could you not have sent a lion to thin the people, or a wolf, or a famine, or a plague? Did you have to destroy everything? And who among us could stop it? All of us swore the oath, but there was a man of surpassing wisdom, and he found a way to survive. It was, in its way, a masterful piece of divine rhetoric. Ea did not quite lie. He did not quite confess. He simply pointed the argument toward mercy. And Enlil, standing on the mountain beside the boat, surrounded by the evidence of what the flood had done, the gods who had wept and the goddess who had called her drowned people fish, was softened. Or perhaps he was moved by a kind of guilt that even the gods do not quite escape. He went up into the boat. He took Utnapishtim by the hand. He took his wife by the hand. He made them kneel on either side of him. He placed a hand on each of them and said, "Hitherto Utnapishtim has been mortal. Henceforth Utnapishtim and his wife shall be like the gods. Utnapishtim shall dwell far away, at the mouth of the rivers." And just like that, in a moment of divine blessing that followed a catastrophic divine punishment, in a moment that was simultaneously the resolution of one story and the beginning of another, Utnapishtim and his wife became the only immortal human beings in the history of the world. They were carried to the mouth of the rivers, to the place beyond the waters, the place where the fresh water met the salt water at the edge of the world. And there they lived, beyond the reach of ordinary time. Until the day that a king of Uruk, 2/3 divine and 1/3 desperate, crossed the waters of death on a boat of stone-tipped poles and arrived at their shore with grief in his eyes. Utnapishtim finished his story. The silence that followed was the silence of someone who has just heard something enormous and is not entirely sure what to do with it. Gilgamesh had come to the end of the world looking for the secret of immortality, and what he had found was a story of a flood, of divine mercy and divine wrath, of a single man who survived a catastrophe by the grace of a god who could not keep a secret. It was not a formula. It was not a recipe. It was not a set of instructions for how to become immortal. Utnapishtim looked at Gilgamesh and asked him the question that the story had been building toward without ever quite naming, "But who will gather the gods for your sake, so that you may find the life that you seek?" The implication was clear. Utnapishtim's immortality had been a singular event, a unique gift, given once, in the aftermath of a catastrophe that could not be repeated, decreed by a god who was moved by a particular confluence of guilt and mercy and the smell of roasting meat on a mountaintop. It was not a thing that could be replicated by an act of will, or by heroic effort, or by being sufficiently deserving. The gods gave it once. They would not give it again. And yet, Utnapishtim was not without some capacity for compassion. He was, after all, a man who had once been mortal himself, who had felt the cold weight of mortality in the night, who had heard the wall speak to him because a god could not bear to watch him drown. He understood something about the gulf between wanting and having. He proposed a test. It was a strange test, modest in its apparent simplicity, devastating in what it revealed. He said to Gilgamesh, "Come, do not sleep for 6 days and 7 nights." Sleep, in the ancient world, was understood as a kind of rehearsal for death. The sleeping person lay still, was unresponsive, was in some sense absent from the world. The Mesopotamian word for sleep was related to the words for shadow and the land of the dead. To sleep was to touch, briefly, the edge of non-being. If Gilgamesh could not stay awake, if he could not even hold off this smallest of death's rehearsals for 6 days and 7 nights, what hope could he have of mastering death itself? Gilgamesh sat down. He was determined. He was the king of Uruk, the 2/3 divine, the man who had walked through the dark tunnel of Mashu and crossed the waters of death and stood at the end of the world. He would not sleep. He was asleep almost immediately. The text says that sleep blew over him like a mist, like a sudden fog that comes without warning and surrounds you before you realize it is there. He sat down to resist sleep, and sleep came and took him anyway. Because he had walked to the end of the world, and he was exhausted, and the body has its own wisdom that does not always defer to the ambitions of kings. Utnapishtim looked at the sleeping Gilgamesh and said to his wife, "Look at this strong man who sought life." Sleep blew over him like a mist. There is a quality to this moment that is almost tender. Utnapishtim was not contemptuous. He was not triumphant. He was, perhaps, simply sad, the sadness of someone who already knew the answer to the question, who knew it would not be the answer the questioner wanted, and who had nevertheless given the questioner a chance to prove him wrong. His wife asked what should be done. She said, "Touch him so that he may wake up, so that he may return in peace to his homeland." But Utnapishtim had a different idea. He said to his wife, "Bake a loaf of bread for each day that he sleeps. Mark the days on the wall." And so while Gilgamesh slept his long and unconscious sleep, his wife of the immortal keeper baked bread. 1 loaf for each day. And she set the loaves beside the sleeping king, day by day, and the loaves grew stale and then moldy and then entirely rotten as the days accumulated, each loaf a day's passage of time made edible and then inedible. 6 days and 7 nights Gilgamesh slept. The same span as the flood. The same span as his first encounter with Shamhat on the steppe. The number that the ancient Mesopotamians used for the great completed units of time, the span of creation, the span of destruction, the span of transformation. And on the 7th day, Utnapishtim touched him. Gilgamesh woke up. The first thing he said, in the bewilderment of waking, was, "I had barely fallen asleep when you touched me and woke me." Utnapishtim showed him the bread. The row of loaves beside him, one fresh, one stale, one that was beginning to turn, one that was moldy, one that was white with mold, one entirely deteriorated, and the last, the oldest, the desiccated ruin of what had once been food. Gilgamesh looked at the bread. He was silent for a long moment. And then he said, "What shall I do? Where shall I go? Death has seized my flesh. In my bedroom, death dwells, and wherever I set my foot, there is death." This is the nadir of the epic. The lowest point. The moment when the hero, who has walked to the end of the world, who has faced monsters and gods and waters that kill on contact, finally faces the thing he has been running from all along, not a monster, not a flood, not an enemy. Just the truth. He could not stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. He could not even resist the smallest thing. What had made him think he could resist the largest? Utnapishtim, seeing the collapse of Gilgamesh's hopes, sent him to bathe in the water of the shore, to wash away the grime of the long journey, to dress himself in clean romance again. He was, in the mythological tradition, renewing the king for the journey home. Restoring some dignity to the beaten man. And his wife, the wife of the immortal man, said something to Utnapishtim. She asked, "This man has journeyed here and suffered so much. What will you give him to carry home?" It is a question of extraordinary grace. She was not asking what Gilgamesh deserved. She was not asking whether the laws of the universe permitted Utnapishtim to give anything. She was asking, from a place of simple human, or once human, compassion, what can we send with him? He came all this way. He tried so hard. He failed, yes, but the trying was real. What can we give him for the road? And Utnapishtim answered. He told Gilgamesh a secret. He said, "I will reveal to you a hidden thing, a secret of the gods. There is a plant at the bottom of the sea. It has thorns that will prick your hands as a rose bush does. If you take this plant, you will find new life. The plant of life. The plant that grows in the deep water, in the abyss of the freshwater sea, in the place where the underground rivers move in their dark courses. The plant that gives life, not quite immortality, the texts are careful not to promise that, but life renewed. Youth restored. A second chance at living." Gilgamesh did not hesitate. He tied stones to his feet as weights, the way divers in the ancient world weighted themselves to sink quickly to depth, and he descended into the sea. Down through the cold, dark water, down to the bottom of the sea, where the plant grew. He felt its thorns cut his hands. He pulled it free. He rose to the surface, releasing the stones, gasping for air, holding in his bleeding hands a plant that might be the closest thing to eternal life that a mortal could touch. He called out to Urshanabi the boatman, "This plant is extraordinary. By its power a man can win new life. I will carry it to Uruk of the strong walls. I will give some to an old man to eat and test the power of this plant. Its name shall be The Old Man Becomes Young. I myself shall eat of it and return to my youth." He carried the plant on the long journey home, across the waters of death, through whatever remained of the road between the end of the world and the beginning of civilization. He carried it with the care that only someone who has lost everything once and found something precious in the loss can manage. And then came the moment that has made readers wince and gasp and feel the particular anguish of cosmic unfairness for 4,000 years. Gilgamesh stopped at a pool of cool water to bathe. He set the plant down at the edge of the pool. And a serpent came up from the depths of the water, smelled the fragrance of the plant, and took it. As the serpent retreated into the water, it shed its skin. And was renewed. This is why snakes shed their skins, in the ancient mythological understanding, because a serpent once stole the plant of life from the king of Uruk, and the power of that plant passed into the serpent's lineage, giving them the ability to renew themselves and go on living while everything else ages and dies. Gilgamesh sat down at the edge of the pool. He wept. He said to Urshanabi the boatman, "For whom has my heart's labor been spent? For whom has my blood been shed? I have not obtained a benefit for myself. I have benefited only the lion of the ground. And now the current will carry it 20 leagues away. When I opened the pit and gathered the equipment, I saw something that made me give up and stop. Is this how it ends?" The raw helplessness of this speech is breathtaking. Gilgamesh, the king, the hero, the man who walked to the edge of the world, is sitting at the side of a pool crying because a snake stole the one thing that could have made all of it worthwhile. The absurdity of it, the smallness of the cause of the final failure, a snake, drawn by a smell, opportunistically grabbing what it found, is part of what makes this moment so enduringly powerful. Because life is often like that. The great journeys, the enormous sacrifices, the long terrible roads to the answer, and then at the last moment, something small and ordinary takes what you were carrying. He continued home. The road home is always different from the road out. When Gilgamesh had left Uruk, he had been running from something. He had been driven by grief and by the terror of his own mortality, pushed out into the wilderness by a fear so large he could not stand still inside it. He had walked with the urgency of a man who believed that if he moved fast enough, far enough, desperately enough, he might outrun what was pursuing him. He had not outrun it. Death was still there. It had always been there. It was still waiting for him, patient as a shadow, as it is patient for everything that breathes. But the Gilgamesh who returned to Uruk was not the same Gilgamesh who had left. He had traveled to the mountain of Mashu and walked through the tunnel of total darkness. He had found the Garden of the Sun and the Tavern Keeper at the edge of the world. He had crossed the waters of death on a boat of expendable poles. He had stood before the only immortal man and heard the oldest story ever told. He had dived to the bottom of the sea with stones tied to his feet and pulled a magical plant from the depths with his bleeding hands. He had lost the plant to a snake. He had sat at the edge of a pool and wept. None of these experiences had given him what he came for. And yet all of them together had given him something. They had given him the story. When Gilgamesh returned to the walls of Uruk, when he came back through the great gates of the city he had built, back into the noise and the color and the smell of bread baking and beer fermenting and children running in the streets and craftsmen working at their benches, he said to Urshanabi the boatman, who had accompanied him on the last part of the road, "Go up, Urshanabi, and walk on the walls of Uruk. Inspect the foundation terrace and examine the brickwork. See if it is not made of kiln-fired brick, and if the 7 wise men did not lay its foundations." These are the same words with which the epic began. The framing is intentional and profound. The Epic of Gilgamesh opens with a description of the walls of Uruk, and it closes with Gilgamesh himself describing the walls of Uruk, the same walls, the same invitation to observe and appreciate. But the meaning has shifted entirely. At the beginning, the walls were a monument to power. They were the evidence of what a great king could compel others to build. They were, in some sense, the expression of Gilgamesh's tyranny, the labor of young men exhausted by their king's ambition. At the end, the walls were something else entirely. They were the monument that Gilgamesh had been seeking all along, the enduring thing, the thing that would outlast him, the evidence that he had been here. But they were not his alone. They had been built by human hands, planned by divine wisdom, and they enclosed within them the life of an entire city, the bakers and the brewers and the priests and the mothers and the children and the old men sitting in the shade. The walls were not the monument of a king. They were the monument of a civilization. And inside the walls, in the foundation, was the tablet. The stone tablet inscribed with the story, with all of this, every word of what we have been telling tonight. The journey and the friendship and the grief and the flood and the failed test and the lost plant and the serpent and the weeping at the pool. Gilgamesh had understood, at last, what Siduri had tried to tell him by the edge of the sea. What Utnapishtim had tried to tell him by the waters of death. What the walls of his own city had been trying to tell him for years. The immortality he had sought was never something you could hold in your hands. You could not eat it, or drink it, or cut it from a plant at the bottom of the sea. It could not be granted by a divine counsel or stolen from a sleeping guardian. It was made of story. Of the things you built and the people you loved and the deeds that were remembered. It was made of the grief of Enkidu's dying and the friendship that had preceded it. It was made of the courage to walk through darkness and cross impossible waters, even when the answer at the end was not the one you wanted. Immortality, the epic tells us, is not the absence of death. It is the persistence of meaning. Gilgamesh inscribed his story on a tablet of lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone of the ancient world, the color of the night sky, the color of the divine. He deposited it in the foundations of the wall. He hid it there, in the stone and brick and mortar of the city he had built, to be found by whoever came after. He was saying, I was here. This happened. I lived, and I lost, and I traveled to the end of everything, and I came back. And the coming back is the story. And the story is enough. We know this because we are still telling it. Thousands of years later, in the ruins of the ancient libraries of Nineveh, in the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who collected texts from across the ancient world and had his scribes copy them onto clay tablets in his great library, the tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh were found. Broken, incomplete, pieces missing, but there. Still there. Still telling the story. They were unearthed in the 19th century by archaeologists digging in the desert of Iraq. They were shipped to the British Museum. And there, in a basement room, a young man named George Smith picked up a fragment of clay and began to read the cuneiform script that had been impressed into it by a Babylonian scribe perhaps 3,000 years before. And he read about a flood. A flood with a boat, and animals taken aboard, and birds released to find dry land, and a man who survived and gave offerings on a mountaintop and was blessed with immortality by the gods. He recognized it. Of course he recognized it. The bones of the story were the bones of a story he had known all his life, told in a different language, with different names, in the pages of a book he had been reading since childhood. But this story was older. This story had been carved in clay before the Bible was written. This story had been told in the cities of Babylon and Nineveh and Ur and Uruk for 2,000 years before the words of Genesis were set down. And standing there in the British Museum with a piece of ancient clay in his hands, George Smith understood something that scholars and storytellers and spiritual seekers and ordinary human beings have been contemplating ever since. The great stories we tell about the world, the flood, the hero's journey, the search for meaning in the face of death, the friendship that changes everything, the loss that remakes us, these stories did not begin with any one tradition. They did not belong to any single people or any single religion. They are older than all of that. They are older than the categories we use to divide ourselves from each other. They rise from something deep in the human experience, something that the very first storytellers, sitting by firelight in cities built between two rivers, already understood and already needed to say. We are mortal. We love. We lose what we love. We travel to the ends of the earth trying to find a way around the loss. And at the end of the road, we come home, and we tell the story. There is a story within the story. Every great myth carries within it not only the tale of its heroes but the tale of its own survival, the improbable, sometimes miraculous sequence of events that brought the words from the moment of their first telling to the ears of the person hearing them now. And in the case of the Epic of Gilgamesh, this story of survival is as fascinating and in some ways as poignant as the epic itself. The tablets on which the epic was preserved were not all written at once, and they were not all found in one place. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists in multiple versions, multiple languages, multiple degrees of completeness, spread across thousands of years of ancient Near Eastern civilization. It is a text that was copied and recopied by generations of scribes who considered it worth preserving, who pressed their reeds into wet clay decade after decade, century after century, in the great scribal schools of Mesopotamia. The oldest fragments of Gilgamesh stories are written in Sumerian, the first written language, the language of the very first cities. These Sumerian tales are not yet the unified epic as we know it. They are individual stories, separate poems about Gilgamesh and the cedar forest, about Gilgamesh and the bowl of heaven, about the death of Enkidu. They are the raw materials, the loose threads, from which a later tradition would weave the unified story. The earliest version of the unified epic, what scholars call the Old Babylonian version, dates to approximately 1700 BCE, to the period when Babylon was the great center of Mesopotamian civilization. This is the version that begins to feel like the story we have been telling tonight, with the friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu at its heart and the quest for immortality as its driving force. But the version that is most complete, the version that gives us the flood story and the full arc of the journey, is the Standard Babylonian version, a masterful literary compilation assembled or edited by a scholar scribe named Simlai-Kanini, probably around 1200 BCE. Simlai-Kanini was an exorcist priest as well as a scholar, and he brought to the text both the religious authority of his priestly office and the literary genius of a great editor. He is one of the first named authors in human history. He shaped the story as we know it. It is Simlai-Kanini's version that was copied into the library of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, ruling in the 7th century BCE, and he was in many ways the Gilgamesh of his own era, powerful, ambitious, devoted to the building of something that would last. Among his great achievements was the construction of the first systematically organized library in history, housed in his palace at Nineveh, in the city that stood near what is now Mosul in northern Iraq. He sent scribes throughout his empire to find texts and copy them. He wrote personally to temples and scholarly institutions demanding that ancient tablets be sent to him or duplicated for his collection. He gathered everything he could find: religious texts, medical treatises, astronomical records, magical formulae, myths, hymns, legal codes. He wanted, in his way, to gather all knowledge in one place. Among the texts he gathered and had copied was the Epic of Gilgamesh. The tablets were arranged in the library, pressed into clay with care, organized and catalogued in a way that suggests genuine scholarly pride in the collection. And then, in 612 BCE, the Assyrian Empire collapsed. The Babylonians and the Medes came together and sacked Nineveh and burned the palace. The library burned. But here is the beautiful, extraordinary paradox that the survival of the epic represents: clay tablets, unlike papyrus scrolls, unlike parchment, unlike paper, clay tablets are improved by fire. The heat that destroyed the palace of Ashurbanipal baked the clay tablets of his library even harder than they already were. The fire that was meant to erase them made them more permanent. They lay in the ruins of Nineveh for more than 2,000 years. Buried beneath the debris of a collapsed civilization, beneath the accumulated centuries of dust and silence, the tablets waited. The cities of the world rose and fell above them. Empires came and went. The Greeks came, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks again under Alexander, and then the Parthians and the Sassanids and the Arabs and the Mongols and the Ottomans. All of this happened over and around the buried ruins of Nineveh, and the clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library lay in the darkness beneath it all. And then, in the 1840s, an English archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard came to the mounds outside the city of Mosul and began to dig. He found Nineveh. He found the palace. He found the carvings, the stone reliefs of lion hunts and battle scenes and divine beings with eagle wings and human faces. He found the rooms of the library, their contents scattered and mixed by the long centuries of burial but still, remarkably, still there. The tablets went to the British Museum in London, more than 20,000 of them, fragmentary and jumbled, requiring the labor of a generation of scholars to sort and identify and begin to read. George Smith, the young numismatist turned cuneiform scholar, was set to work on the tablets in the early 1870s. He was self-taught, he had not gone to university, had not studied under famous professors, had learned to read cuneiform by spending his lunch breaks in the museum's basement examining the tablets. He was, in his own way, a kind of Enkidu, an outsider who found his way into the world of scholars not through the gates of established learning but through sheer, wild, ungovernable passion for the work. When he read the flood story on what is now known as Tablet 11 of the Epic, when he pieced together the narrative of Utnapishtim and the boat and the birds and the mountain and the divine blessing, he knew immediately what he was looking at. He knew that this was older than Genesis. He knew that the story of Noah had a predecessor, and that the predecessor was sitting in his hands on a piece of fired clay in the basement of the British Museum. The world, when he announced his discovery in December 1872, was astonished. The implications were enormous and discomfiting for those who had believed that the biblical narrative was unique and original. The questions raised by Smith's discovery, about the relationship between the Mesopotamian flood traditions and the Hebrew scriptures, about the borrowing or parallel development of religious narratives across cultures, about the nature of myth and revelation, are questions that scholars and theologians are still debating 150 years later. But there was also something simpler and more beautiful in the discovery, something that cut through all the theological complexity. The story had survived. A man in ancient Mesopotamia had pressed a reed into wet clay and told a story about a king who loved his friend and lost him and traveled to the end of the world in his grief. And the story had survived fire, collapse, burial, 2,500 years of silence, and the disintegration of every civilization that had come after the one that first told it. It had survived because clay is tougher than empire, because a story well told has a kind of structural integrity that outlasts the structure of any state. And it had survived because the story was true, not factually true in every detail, not historically true in the sense of newspaper reporting, but true in the way that only the deepest human stories are true, true to the experience of being alive, of loving and losing, of being afraid of death, of searching for meaning at the ends of the earth. True in the way that still speaks to us tonight, here, for 1,000 years after it was first set down in clay, as we listen to the story in the soft darkness of our own time. Gilgamesh is still walking. Enkidu is still running on the steppe. The flood is still rising. The raven is still flying over the receding waters, looking for a place to land. And the walls of Uruk are still standing in the text, still waiting to be walked upon, still inviting us to examine the foundation, to inspect the brickwork, to see if it is not made of kiln-fired brick. We have come a long way tonight. From the walls of Uruk to the dark tunnel through the mountain. From the wild steppe where Enkidu first opened his eyes to the cedar forest where a guardian fell. From the wedding house where two great men fought and then embraced, to the pool at the edge of the road home where a serpent swam away with the last hope of immortality. From the flood. Always, the flood. It is worth sitting with the flood for a while longer, not as a historical event or a geological curiosity or a theological controversy, but as a story. As the oldest flood story we have, the one that all the later tellings carry somewhere in their deep structure, the one that established the framework within which human beings have been thinking about catastrophe and survival and divine will and mercy for 4,000 years. What does the flood mean? In the Mesopotamian tradition, the flood is not primarily a story about punishment. Or rather, it is a story about punishment. Yes, the gods were disturbed, the earth was too loud, something had gone wrong in the great project of creation and a correction was needed. But the punishment is not the point of the story. The point of the story is the survival. The point is Ea whispering to the wall of the reed hut. The point is the plant of immortality hidden in the deep water. The point is the reed hut that becomes a boat, and the boat that becomes a mountain, and the mountain from which the birds are sent out to find dry land. The flood, in this tradition, is the crisis in which what matters most becomes visible. Before the flood, everything was there, the people, the animals, the cities, the fields, the gods and their temples receiving their offerings. It was all just the ordinary texture of the world, unremarkable in its presence. The flood stripped it all away. And in the stripping away, Utnapishtim, ordinary mortal man, inhabitant of an ordinary mortal city, had to decide what to put in the boat. He had to choose what survived. He chose life. He chose the seeds of all living creatures. He chose his family and his craftsmen and his provisions. He chose, in other words, not power or wealth or prestige, not gold, though he took some, or weapons or status, but the things that make life possible. This is the flood as a thought experiment, as an ancient philosophical exercise in values. If you had to choose what to carry through the catastrophe, what would it be? What is actually essential? What is worth saving? And the answer the epic gives us is always the same: life itself, in all its variety and vulnerability. The craftsman and the animal and the seed of grain. The love between one person and another. The story that gets pressed into clay and left in the wall. The relationship between the Mesopotamian flood narrative and the Hebrew story of Noah has been discussed and debated since George Smith's 1872 announcement, and the scholarly consensus is now fairly clear: the stories are related. The specific details, the boat, the storm, the birds, the mountain, the offering on the mountaintop, the divine blessing of the survivor, are too similar to be coincidental. The Hebrew people had lived in Mesopotamia. They had been carried there in the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE, and many of them had remained. They had been immersed in Babylonian culture, had learned Babylonian language, had encountered the great texts of the tradition that included the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the crucible of that experience, in the exile and the loss and the desperate need to preserve identity and meaning, they had done what storytellers throughout human history have always done. They had taken the stories of the world they were living in, and they had retold them in the light of their own understanding of the divine. The God of Genesis is one. The gods of the epic are many, quarrelsome, subject to their own passions and fears, capable of weeping at the consequences of their own decisions. In Genesis, the flood comes as a moral judgment, specific, righteous, tied to the wickedness of human behavior. In the epic, the flood comes from something more ambiguous: divine irritability, overpopulation, the sheer noise of human life disturbing the gods' sleep. But in both stories, one man is warned. In both stories, a boat is built. In both stories, the waters rise and everything is lost except what is carried on the boat. In both stories, birds are released. In both stories, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. In both stories, an offering is made, and the divine receives it, and a covenant is established. The differences are theological. The similarities are human. And this is perhaps the deepest truth that the Epic of Gilgamesh has to offer us, across the vast distance of its age, that beneath the theological differences, beneath the cultural differences, beneath the different names of the gods and the different languages of the prayers and the different details of the ritual, human beings have been telling essentially the same stories. Stories about the end of the world and the beginning again. Stories about the one who survives and what the survival cost. Stories about the love between friends. Stories about the grief that will not be comforted by philosophy or advice or the well-intentioned counsel of the wise. Stories about the long road to the place where the answers are supposed to be, and the discovery that the answers are not quite what was expected. Stories about coming home. Because in the end, that is what the Epic of Gilgamesh is. It is a homecoming story. Gilgamesh left Uruk as a half-formed king, magnificent but incomplete, powerful but blind to the most important things. He traveled through loss and grief and the impossible darkness of the mountain and the fatal waters and the end of the world. He received a gift he could not keep. He failed a test he had believed he could pass. And then he came home. He came home to the walls he had built, to the city that held his people, to the streets where the bread sellers and the boat makers and the children and the priests went about the ordinary extraordinary business of being alive. He came home to the place where Enkidu had walked beside him, where they had sat together at feasts, where two friends had shared the kind of conversations that only happen between people who truly know each other. Enkidu was not there. That was the irreducible fact, the loss that could not be argued away or philosophized out of existence. Enkidu was gone, and no plant from the bottom of the sea, no blessing from the edge of the world, was going to change that. But Gilgamesh was there. Still breathing. Still standing on the earth. Still capable of looking up at the wall he had built and feeling something, pride, maybe, or wonder, or the particular combination of grief and gratitude that comes when you have survived something that you were not sure you would survive. And the wall was there. The baked brick, the foundation terrace, the gate of cedar, the structure that would outlast him. That was already outlasting everyone who had worked to build it. The story is the wall. The story is the monument. The story is the thing that endures. And here we are, in the soft dark of tonight, and the story is still enduring. Still speaking. Still finding its way into the ears of people who need to hear it, people who know what it is to lose someone, people who know what it is to be afraid of what waits at the end of everything, people who have walked to the ends of their own particular worlds looking for an answer and come back with something other than what they went looking for. Gilgamesh was 2/3 God and 1/3 man. The divine third could walk through darkness, could cross impossible waters, could face monsters without flinching. But the human third, that small, mortal, grieving, frightened, beloved human third, was the part that needed a friend. The part that wept at the edge of a pool because a snake stole the last hope. The part that came home and looked at the wall and understood, at last, that the wall was enough. The human third is always enough. It is enough to have loved. It is enough to have walked the distance, even if the destination was not the one you intended. It is enough to have told the story, to have pressed the reed into the clay while the night was still, and left the words in the wall for whoever came after. You are whoever came after. And the words found you. We are coming back now, slowly. Like Gilgamesh returning from the edge of the world. Like the waters receding from the mountaintop. Like the raven finding dry land after the long, patient, unknowing flight over the flood. You are here. In your bed, in the soft and ordinary darkness of a night that is yours. The ancient world and its rivers and its clay tablets and its walls of kiln-fired brick are settling back into the distance, not vanishing, never quite vanishing, but receding to the place where stories live when they are not being told. Let your body sink a little deeper into the surface beneath you. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm, the ancient rhythm that your body has always known, the rhythm that does not need your attention to continue, that will carry you gently through this night as it has carried you through every other night of your life. The walls of Uruk are still standing somewhere in the deep structure of the world. Enkidu is still running in the tall grass of the open steppe, for the first time, before the hunters came, before Shamhat, before the city changed everything and friendship changed everything. He is still there, perfect and wild and complete, in the place where all beloved things live before we know we will lose them. And Gilgamesh is at his desk of lapis lazuli, pressing the reed into the clay, his hands still bearing the faint marks of the thorns of the plant he found and lost at the bottom of the sea. He is writing the story. He is leaving it in the wall. He is giving it to you. Carry nothing tonight. Set down the grief and the searching and the long road you have traveled. Let the story hold you for a little while, the oldest story, the one that says, you were here, and it mattered, and the wall is enough. Sleep now. Let the soft darkness of this night carry you where the flood cannot reach, where the waters of death are only a name in an old text, where the end of the world is a place you do not need to visit tonight. You are home. You are home. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.